Anyway, you can see here our agenda that just lists some of the things we're going to talk about today. And let's kick it off by really jumping into some disturbing news when it comes to what's happening with the coronavirus around the world. And this is where it's obviously important to remember that pandemic's global, which means even though some parts of North America, some parts of the United States and Canada may be successful at containing it, that doesn't mean the pandemic is going away. And a real illustration of that are the variants or strains that are starting to emerge. The South African strain is one example, which this New York Times article talks about. The UK strain is another. And the challenge, of course, is that with each of these strains, the effectiveness of a vaccine decreases, the extent to which that strain can spread through a population. And that's where, unfortunately, the Brazil COVID variant is now even most disturbing, in part because of the devastation that's happening in Manaus. Now, Manaus is a city in the Amazon in northern Brazil. They were devastated earlier in the year in terms of really overwhelmed in terms of their health infrastructure, thousands of deaths. And so, ironically, what happened in Manaus is they achieved herd immunity. But unfortunately, we're now learning that herd immunity isn't enough. That part of what we're seeing in the resurgence of COVID-19 in Manaus is that, unfortunately, the way in which the virus evolves, the way in which the strains, in order to survive, in order to spread, that they are then able to essentially adapt both the body's immunity but also the coronavirus in terms of the vaccine and the vaccine's immunity. So it all presents, I think, a real challenge to the narrative that we've been looking at from a society in terms of, putting all our hopes in a vaccine or hoping that herd immunity and just allowing the virus and disease to run its course will be sufficient in terms of, ending this pandemic. And unfortunately, we're finding that's not the case. That, in fact, the speed at which this virus is not only able to infect, but able to evolve makes it very potent and makes it a very serious threat when it comes to the way in which we've been currently framing at least our response to this pandemic, let alone how it's managed. So I encourage those of you, watching to keep a close eye on what we're seeing in Manaus, and in particular the current wave that they're hitting, because it sort of debunks or, pulls the air out of the herd immunity or the Hail Mary of the vaccines, that instead we need to be looking at a much more diverse approach, a much more holistic or comprehensive approach. Otherwise, we could face the same fate that currently rural Brazil and many other parts of the world are. And it at least from an encouraging perspective, does recognize that as these new strains start to flourish, hopefully we'll return to the idea of all for one, that this really is about all of us together, kind of having to work together. Part of that means isolating. Part of that means spending time at home, watching Twitch, watching other streaming services, and, not traveling, not engaging in the public, wearing a mask. But unfortunately, we know that compliance there is not that great. And it suggests that, we're going to need greater measures. And that might be incentives in terms of funding and social support programs so that people are encouraged to stay home, so that folks who can't find work, are not compelled to go and engage in risky behavior. But I think the combination of, undermining the herd immunity argument and decreasing the effectiveness of vaccines suggests that our whole language around the virus, our whole approach to it in terms of trying to tame it, is not going to work. And that rather than wishful thinking and hoping that this pandemic is going to go away come spring and summer, an easy prediction to make right now is 2021 is not only going to be as dominated by the pandemic as 2020, but even more so. And it's because we're not anticipating the speed by which the virus evolves and not factoring in that it's a global pandemic. So if it is flourishing unrestricted in the developing world, if it's finding dense global cities to evolve and mutate, then it really doesn't matter what vaccines or what measures that we're taking here at home. It won't be enough to end this pandemic. It won't be enough to stop the infectiousness of this disease. So it's pretty disturbing in a general sense, in that I think we're all experiencing a little bit of COVID fatigue. We're all getting a sense that, we wish this pandemic would end. But unfortunately, we're getting a lot of stupidity from our leaders, whether public health officials or politicians, and we're not getting the necessary buy-in from the rest of society that's really necessary if we're all going to educate ourselves and all be informed about really the opportunities to curb the virus, non-pharmaceutically, i.e. we can't just rely on vaccines, but also universally. It can't be, each one against the other. It can't be a scrambling race to protect one against and hope that herd immunity works out, because that's not going to work either. So I think it offers us a real difficult challenge.